Chapter 121 When the World Begins to Whisper. The settlement bell echoed across Haven before dawn. Its deep wooden tone rolled through the quiet valley, drifting over rooftops, workshops, warehouses, and fields still hidden beneath a thin blanket of morning mist. One by one, lights appeared behind wooden windows. Doors creaked open. The familiar rhythm of another day quietly began. A baker knelt beside his stone oven, feeding dry firewood into the glowing embers. The smell of freshly baked bread slowly spread through the streets. Across the square, the blacksmith had already begun heating iron. His young apprentice yawned while carrying buckets of water. "You stayed up too late again," the old blacksmith said without looking up. "I was cultivating." The apprentice defended himself. The old man laughed. "No. You were trying to cultivate." The snoring from your room reached my workshop. Several nearby workers burst into laughter. The embarrassed boy scratched his head. "Maybe I slept halfway through." Near the academy, children arrived in small groups carrying bark paper notebooks beneath their arms. Unlike before, many no longer came because they had to. They came because they wanted to. One little girl proudly carried a strange purple flower. Another had collected several unusual stones from the riverbank. A boy hurried inside carrying a nest that had already been abandoned by its birds. "Teacher!" he shouted excitedly. "I found this beside the western forest." Nia looked up from her desk. "What made you bring it here?" The boy answered without hesitation. "Because I don't know why it's empty." Nia smiled warmly. "And that's a very good reason." She carefully placed the nest onto a shelf marked "Things we don't yet understand." The shelf had become surprisingly full. Elsewhere, Sunling walked slowly through Haven. Not because he had nowhere to be, but because he had made it a habit. He greeted the farmers repairing irrigation channels, helped an elderly woman move several baskets of vegetables, stopped to admire a carpenter's newest folding chair, listened as two hunters argued over which trail offered the better fishing spots. Months ago, every conversation had been about survival. Now, people debated ordinary things. He quietly treasured that change. Near the northern gate, Hanwei was already preparing today's patrol. 6 experienced hunters checked their bows. Another packed dried meat into cloth bags. One carefully sharpened a spearhead while quietly humming a tune from Earth. The old hunter who had joined Haven weeks ago tightened the straps on his leather armor before looking toward the forest. "You've noticed it too," he suddenly said. Hanwei looked over. "The silence?" The old hunter nodded. "I've hunted for more than 40 years. I've never trusted a forest that stops talking." Neither man spoke again. Instead, Hanwei quietly opened his journal. He added another line beneath yesterday's entry. "Morning birds still absent near the northern trails." He closed the journal. No conclusions. Only observations. The patrol left shortly after sunrise. The gates closed behind them. Haven returned to its peaceful rhythm. Inside the academy, morning lessons had already begun. Today's lesson wasn't mathematics, nor writing, nor engineering. Nia stood before a large charcoal board. Across its surface were dozens of questions gathered over recent weeks. Some had small answers written beneath them. Many remained blank. She looked toward the children. "Does anyone remember today's assignment?" Nearly every hand shot into the air. A cheerful little girl answered first. "We have to bring one question." Not an answer. A question. Nia nodded approvingly. "Good. Because answers help us understand today." She smiled gently. "But good questions help us understand tomorrow." The classroom fell into thoughtful silence. Then, one by one, children approached the board. "Why do glowing insects only appear after sunset? Why are some rivers colder than others? Why do horned deer never drink from the northern stream? Why do some people cultivate faster?" The last question made Nia pause. She looked toward the boy who had written it. "What made you ask that?" The boy shrugged. "My older brother and I started cultivating together. We practice the same way. We eat the same food." He lowered his head. "But I'm still behind him." The room became quiet. No one laughed. No one teased him. Because several adults had begun wondering the same thing. Nia slowly wrote a small note beneath the question. "Needs observation." She didn't pretend to know. That honesty was becoming one of the Academy's greatest lessons. Outside, Gray Fox sat beneath the old riverside tree with his eyes closed. He wasn't cultivating. At least, not in the way humans understood cultivation. The breeze gently stirred the silver strands of his hair. The river flowed steadily beside him. After several quiet minutes, his eyes slowly opened. He looked toward the northern mountains. Then, toward the western horizon. A faint frown appeared. So, he murmured to himself, "It has begun." No one stood nearby to hear him. Late that morning, Sun Ling entered the academy carrying several hunter journals. Nia immediately looked up. "More reports?" He nodded. "The Northern Patrol. The Western Patrol. The Eastern Survey." She accepted them one by one. As she began reading, her expression gradually became thoughtful. The first journal mentioned quieter mornings. The second described fewer monster tracks. The third reported unusual migration patterns among small animals. None of them mentioned danger. Yet, all three described change. Sun Ling quietly spread the journals across the table. Alongside them he placed records from previous weeks. Then older ones. Then even older reports from shortly after the first trial. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply compared. Read. Rearranged. Read again. Finally, Sun Ling rested his finger on one line. Then another. Then a third. "They're increasing." Nia looked closer. "What is?" He pointed toward the dates. "The time between observations." She frowned. "I don't understand." Sun Ling picked up two journals. The first report mentioned fewer wolves. He placed it down. 3 weeks later, he picked up another. Someone noticed fewer birds. Another journal. Then fewer insects. One more. And now, he tapped today's report. The forest itself feels quieter. The room fell silent. None of the changes had happened suddenly. Each one was almost too small to notice. Until someone looked at all of them together. Nia slowly leaned back in her chair. "So?" she whispered. "It isn't that the forest changed yesterday." Sun Ling nodded. "No. It has been changing." He looked toward the open window where the distant tree line swayed gently beneath the morning breeze. This whole time, outside, the children continued laughing. Builders continued working. The bakery continued selling bread. Haven remained peaceful. Completely unaware that the world around it had already begun whispering of changes yet to come. The academy became unusually quiet. Not because the children had left, but because the adults had stopped speaking. Hunter journals covered nearly every table. Each report, by itself, seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a picture no one had intended to draw. Nia slowly picked up another journal. This report is from day 32. She carefully placed it beside another. And this one is from day 79. Sun Ling leaned over the table. Both reports described the same valley. The same stream. The same hunting route. Yet, they felt like descriptions of two different places. The first entry read: morning birds nested along the eastern ridge. 3 wolf packs heard before sunrise. Horned deer grazing near the stream. The newer reports simply read: morning unusually quiet. Only one distant howl. No horned deer observed. Neither report claimed danger. Neither claimed safety. They simply recorded what was seen. Nia looked toward the large wall where hundreds of questions had been written over the past several weeks. One question suddenly caught her attention. Why do horned deer avoid the northern stream? She quietly walked over. Below it, she added another line. Do they avoid it? Or are they avoiding something beyond it? Sun Ling watched without interrupting. Questions were slowly becoming theories. Outside, life continued exactly as it always had. The smell of bread drifted through the streets. Builders argued over measurements. Children laughed while chasing each other between the houses. Nothing suggested the world was changing. Perhaps that was what made it dangerous. Near the marketplace, an elderly farmer sat beneath a tree sharpening his sickle. Chen Yu happened to walk past carrying several sacks of grain. Morning. The old farmer greeted. Morning. Chun Yu smiled. Getting ready for tomorrow? The farmer shook his head. No. I'm waiting. For what? The old man looked toward the western hills. For the birds. Chen Yu frowned. What birds? The little yellow ones. They always arrive before sunrise. They eat the insects hiding in my fields. He looked genuinely puzzled. They haven't visited for several mornings. Chen Yu's smile slowly faded. You've noticed too. The farmer looked surprised. Noticed what? Chen Yu didn't answer. Instead, he quietly helped the old man finish sharpening the sickle. Elsewhere, Han Wei's hunting party continued following the northern river. Today's patrol wasn't searching for monsters. Nor resources. Only observations. The forest remained beautiful. Sunlight filtered gently through the branches. Wildflowers swayed beside the trail. Crystal clear water flowed peacefully downstream. Nothing appeared wrong. Yet, the hunters felt uneasy. One young hunter finally broke the silence. Am I imagining it? Or does the forest smell different? The old hunter beside him stopped walking. He inhaled slowly. Then nodded. The scent of pine is stronger. Han Wei knelt beside the riverbank. The mud still held dozens of footprints. Small animals. Birds. Several rabbits. Everything looked normal. Until he noticed something strange. All of them faced the same direction. West. He silently called the others over. Nobody spoke. They simply stared at the countless tracks crossing the damp earth. One hunter whispered. They're all leaving. The old hunter slowly shook his head. No. They're going somewhere. Those two ideas were very different. Han Wei carefully sketched the tracks into his journal. No guesses. Only facts. By midday, the patrol reached a familiar hill overlooking the valley. For years, it had been one of the best places to observe wildlife. Today, they waited. 10 minutes. 20. Nearly half an hour. Nothing appeared. Not a single horned deer. No wolves. No large birds circling overhead. Even the insects seemed fewer than before. The youngest hunter shifted uncomfortably. I don't like this. Han Wei looked across the endless sea of trees. Neither did he. Back in Haven, Gray Fox stood beside the river watching the water wheel turn. Its slow rhythm echoed softly across the valley. Footsteps approached. It calms you too? Sun Ling asked. Gray Fox smiled faintly. No. It reminds me. Of what? Gray Fox rested one hand against the weathered wooden frame. That water never stops moving. It changes. It finds new paths. It goes around obstacles. It adapts. Sun Ling listened quietly. Gray Fox looked toward the distant forest. Humans believe they are adapting to Genesis. He paused. But what if Genesis is adapting too? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The question lingered in the air between them. Not frightening. Simply unsettling. Late that afternoon, the hunters returned. Their catch was smaller than usual. Not because they had failed. Because there had been less to hunt. Han Wei carried his journal directly to the academy. He didn't even stop at home. Nia looked up immediately. What did you find? Han Wei placed the journal onto the table. He opened it to today's final page. There, carefully drawn in charcoal, were dozens of tiny footprints. Every one of them pointing west. No explanation. No conclusion. Only one sentence beneath the sketch. Nothing appears to be fleeing. Everything appears to be following something. The room became silent once again. Outside, the afternoon sun slowly dipped toward the horizon. Children still laughed. Merchants still traded. The bakery still sold its final loaves of bread. Haven remained blissfully unaware. But beyond its peaceful walls, Genesis had already begun moving. Not with an earthquake. Not with war. Not with monsters. With something far quieter. A change so slow that only those who paid attention could hear it. Chapter 122 Different Paths. The next morning, The academy opened earlier than usual. Not because classes had changed, but because the teachers had. Long before sunrise, several oil lamps already burned inside the main hall. Books, journals, loose bark paper, and charcoal sketches covered nearly every table. For the first time since Haven was founded, the academy wasn't preparing to teach. It was preparing to investigate. Nia carefully pinned another hunter's report onto a large wooden board. Beside it, she attached weather records, crop journals, river observations, even children's drawings. At first glance, the board looked chaotic. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sun Ling stepped inside carrying another stack of journals. "I borrowed these from the warehouse." He smiled. "I don't think anyone expected grain inventories to become research material." Nia laughed quietly. "They're more useful than you think." She opened one of the ledgers. Day 41. 3 sacks of grain consumed every week. Day 58. Still 3 sacks. Day 76. Only 2.5 sacks. Sun Ling frowned. "Did we lose people?" Nia shook her head. "No. We gained 36. Both of them fell silent. That made no sense. "Maybe people are eating less," Sun Ling suggested. "Maybe," Nia replied. "But why?" She quickly wrote another note. Question number 67. Why has food consumption decreased despite population growth? No answers. Only another mystery. Outside, the settlement slowly came to life. Near the southern fields, several farmers were already working. One of them, Old Lou, had become something of a legend among Haven's children. Not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he always seemed to know when rain was coming. This morning, he was carrying sacks of compost nearly twice as heavy as he had managed only a month earlier. A younger farmer hurried over. "Careful. I'll help." Old Lou laughed. "I appreciate it. But..." He effortlessly placed the heavy sack onto his shoulder. "I don't think I need it anymore." The younger man blinked. "You've gotten stronger." Old Lou looked down at his own hands. He slowly flexed his fingers. Then frowned. "I suppose I have." He hadn't noticed. Across the fields, another farmer overheard the conversation. "I thought it was just me," he admitted. "My back doesn't hurt anymore." Someone else joined in. "I haven't caught a cold in weeks. My breathing feels easier. My eyesight at night has improved." The conversation spread naturally. Nobody claimed to have become a cultivator. Nobody talked about breakthroughs. They simply noticed small changes. Near the blacksmith's workshop, the situation wasn't much different. The apprentice who had once struggled to lift a hammer now swung it with surprising confidence. The old blacksmith watched quietly. "When did your arms get stronger?" The boy stopped. He genuinely didn't know. "I've just been working. And cultivating," the blacksmith added. The apprentice scratched his head. "I suppose." The old man remained thoughtful. Perhaps the two were connected. At the academy, children had begun arriving for class. Instead of their usual lessons, Nia placed a simple question on the board. "Today's observation. What has changed about you?" The room became strangely quiet. Children weren't used to thinking about themselves that way. One little girl raised her hand. "I don't get scared walking to school anymore." Nia smiled. She wrote it down. Another boy stood. "My grandfather says I stopped coughing during winter." He paused. "Whatever winter is." The classroom erupted in laughter. Even Nia couldn't help smiling. "We still don't know if Genesis has winters," she admitted. "So?" She crossed out the word. "Let's write during the cold mornings." Another child slowly spoke. "I can remember lessons easier. My sister wakes up before I do now. My mother doesn't get tired carrying water." Every answer, no matter how small, found its place on the board. Meanwhile, Gray Fox quietly observed the lesson from outside the window. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched. Children noticed changes in themselves long before adults did. Perhaps because they weren't afraid of being wrong. Just before noon, Hanwei returned from checking several traps near the northern forest. He hadn't expected to visit the academy. Yet, as he passed the open doorway, he overheard the children's discussion. What has changed about you? He stopped walking. Without realizing it, he thought about the question himself. His breathing steadier. His hearing sharper. His hands less tired after long hunts. His senses somehow clearer. None of it had happened overnight. It had happened one ordinary day at a time. He quietly entered the academy. Nia looked surprised. Hanwei? He removed his hunting journal. Then, for the very first time, instead of recording changes in Genesis, he turned to a blank page. Across the top, he slowly wrote, "Changes I have noticed in myself." He stared at those words for several moments, then smiled faintly. Perhaps the academy had been asking the wrong question. Not only, how is Genesis changing? But also, how is Genesis changing us? Outside, a gentle breeze moved through Haven. The water wheel continued its steady rhythm. Children laughed in the courtyard. Builders raised another section of the warehouse roof. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet beneath that ordinary day, something invisible was quietly unfolding. Not a battle. Not a disaster. An evolution. One so gradual that humanity had almost failed to notice it. The afternoon bell echoed softly across Haven. Children rushed out of the academy carrying today's assignment. Not homework. Not calculations. Not writing practice. Only a single question. Observe yourself. Many of them looked confused. Some looked excited. Others immediately began comparing answers before they had even left the courtyard. A little boy stretched his arms proudly. "I can climb the watchtower without stopping now." His friend immediately replied, "That's because you cheat." "I don't. You use the side ladder." The argument continued all the way across the square, making several adults laugh. Watching from the academy entrance, Nia quietly smiled. Children rarely realized it, but they often noticed the truth long before adults did. Meanwhile, inside the workshop district, the rhythmic sound of hammers echoed through Haven. The old blacksmith was forging several farming tools while his apprentice worked the bellows. After nearly an hour, the old man suddenly stopped. "Something's wrong." The apprentice immediately became nervous. "Did I ruin the metal?" "No. The fire." Both of them stared into the forge. The flames danced steadily. Nothing appeared unusual. The apprentice scratched his head. "It looks normal." "It does." The old blacksmith agreed. "But..." He slowly reached one hand toward the heat. "It doesn't feel as hot." The apprentice looked surprised. "But the iron melted faster today." The two exchanged puzzled looks. One observation. Two completely different experiences. The old blacksmith quietly extinguished the fire. He wasn't looking for answers anymore. He wanted measurements. "I'll visit the academy tonight," he decided. Elsewhere, near the southern fields, Old Lou rested beneath a large tree after finishing his work. Several younger farmers joined him carrying water. One of them laughed. "I used to hate these fields." Old Lou looked over. "Why?" "They were too big." "And now?" The young man smiled. "They're still too big." Everyone laughed. "But..." He looked across the rows of crops. "I don't become exhausted anymore." Another farmer nodded. "I noticed the same." A woman sitting nearby added quietly, "My hands heal faster." She held up her palms. Only faint scars remained where deep cuts had once been. The conversation gradually grew. No one claimed anything extraordinary. No one spoke of miracles. Every change was ordinary, yet impossible to ignore. That evening, the academy remained open long after sunset. Oil lamps illuminated every table. Teachers, hunters, farmers, craftsmen. Even the old blacksmith arrived carrying several pages filled with careful notes. Sun Ling looked around the room. Only a few months ago, most of these people had never written anything beyond their own names. Now, They voluntarily recorded observations for future generations. That thought alone made him smile. Nia stepped to the front of the room. Thank you all for coming. She looked around. I've read every report submitted today. She held up a small stack of papers. At first, I believed everyone was describing different things. She placed the reports onto the table. But after reading them again, I realized something. She drew 2 large circles on the charcoal board. Inside the first, she wrote Genesis. Inside the second, she wrote humanity. Then, she drew a line connecting them. 4 weeks. She explained. We've only studied the first circle. She tapped the word Genesis. We observed rivers, animals, weather, plants. She paused. But today, we began observing ourselves. Silence settled over the room. Old Lou slowly stood. So, he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The stronger body. The easier breathing. The faster recovery. Those aren't separate discoveries? Nia nodded. I don't think so. I think. She looked toward Sunling. They may all be connected. The room erupted into quiet discussion. Some believed it was because of hard work. Others thought it came from better food. Several hunters argued it was simply because they had survived the first trial. Grey Fox, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. You are all correct. The room instantly became quiet. He walked toward the board. Without asking permission, he picked up a piece of charcoal. Beneath the 2 circles, he wrote a single word. Adaptation. He stepped back. Food changes the body. Work changes the muscles. Experience changes the mind. Cultivation. He paused. Changes all 3. Nobody interrupted him. But, he continued calmly. Do not mistake adaptation for power. His golden eyes slowly swept across the room. Many civilizations believed cultivation existed to make them stronger. They were wrong. The room became so quiet that the crackling oil lamp seemed loud. Grey Fox looked toward the open window where the night breeze gently stirred the curtains. Cultivation exists. He spoke softly. Because Genesis never stops changing. If you stop adapting, Genesis leaves you behind. Those words settled heavily in every heart. Not as fear. As understanding. Sunling lowered his gaze. For some reason, the sentence felt strangely familiar. As though it explained something he had always known, but had never been able to put into words. The meeting ended without any dramatic conclusion. No cultivation technique was revealed. No secret realm was unlocked. No system notification appeared. Only one new page was added to the Academy's records. Academy Research Log Number 1. Current observations. People are changing at different rates. Physical recovery has improved across multiple professions. Cultivation appears to influence everyday life, not only combat. Genesis continues showing gradual environmental changes. Conclusion. Insufficient information. Continue observing. Late that night, after everyone else had gone home, Sunling remained alone inside the academy. The room was illuminated by only a single lamp. He quietly reread Grey Fox's final sentence. If you stop adapting, Genesis leaves you behind. He closed the notebook. Then looked toward the shelves filled with journals. Hundreds of observations. Thousands of questions. Countless unknowns. For the first time, he realized something. The Academy wasn't collecting information. It was learning how to survive a world that refused to stand still. Outside, the valley slept peacefully beneath countless unfamiliar stars. Somewhere beyond Haven, animals continued their silent migration. Ancient forests quietly transformed. And deep within Genesis itself, change continued. Whether humanity noticed it or not. Chapter 123, The Measure of Growth. Morning sunlight slowly spilled across Haven. The valley awakened beneath a sky washed in pale gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth through the settlement. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet, the previous night's meeting lingered in everyone's thoughts. If you stop adapting, Genesis leaves you behind. Grey Fox's words quietly echoed through Haven. Nobody repeated them aloud. But everyone remembered them. For the first time, People didn't begin their day asking, what work needs to be done? Instead, many found themselves wondering, have I changed? Near the southern fields, Old Lou stood alone beside the irrigation channel. He wasn't planting. He wasn't harvesting. He simply stared at the flowing water. A young farmer approached. Master Lou? The old man looked over. Would you throw me one of those stones? The younger man looked confused but obeyed. He tossed a small pebble. Old Lou caught it effortlessly. Again. Another stone. Then another. Then another. Each one landed perfectly in his weathered hand. The younger farmer scratched his head. You've always been quick. Old Lou slowly shook his head. No. I used to miss half of them. The young farmer laughed. I think you're just remembering yourself as worse than you were. Old Lou smiled. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. Instead of arguing, he quietly wrote something inside a small notebook. The academy had encouraged everyone to carry one. At first, most people considered it unnecessary. Now, more and more journals appeared throughout Haven. His first entry read, Day 102. My hands react faster than before. Unsure why. Across the settlement, the blacksmith's apprentice was facing a very different problem. Clang. His hammer struck the iron. Too hard. The glowing metal bent completely out of shape. The old blacksmith stared silently. Again. The apprentice frowned. I barely used any strength. You did. The old man replied. You simply don't realize how much stronger you've become. The apprentice looked at his own hands. They were still the same hands. No larger. No different. Yet, something had changed. Instead of scolding him, the old blacksmith walked to a shelf. He returned carrying 3 iron rods. Each weighed slightly more than the last. Lift them. The apprentice did. Without difficulty. The old blacksmith silently added a 4th. Then a 5th. The boy still managed. Finally, the 6th rod barely moved. There. The old man smiled. Now we know. The apprentice looked confused. Know what? You've grown. But growth should be measured, not guessed. Those simple words would later become one of the academy's guiding principles. Inside the academy, Nia was already surrounded by teachers. Several large sheets of bark paper covered an entire wall. At the top, she had written a new title. Human Observation Project. Beneath it, dozens of names. Not rankings. Not talent. Not strength. Only observations. Sun Ling quietly read through them. Old Lou. Greater endurance. Faster reaction. Reduced fatigue. Blacksmith apprentice. Increased physical strength. Difficulty judging new limits. Han Wei. Sharper hearing. Better night vision. Chun Yu. Faster recovery after training. More names filled the list. Every profession. Every age. Every background. Nia looked toward Sun Ling. Do you notice something? He read the entire board once more. Then, his eyes slowly widened. No one changed in the same way. Nia nodded. Exactly. If cultivation simply made people stronger. She pointed toward the list. Everyone should become stronger in the same way. But they haven't. The hunters developed sharper senses. The farmers gained endurance. The craftsmen became steadier. The children. She smiled. Learn faster. The room became thoughtful. A teacher quietly asked. Then, what exactly is cultivation? No one answered. Not because they didn't want to. Because nobody knew. Just then, Gray Fox entered the academy carrying something wrapped in faded cloth. He walked directly to the center table. Without a word, he carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a smooth stone tablet. Dark blue. Covered in unfamiliar symbols. Unlike anything humanity had ever written. Everyone gathered around it. Sun Ling frowned. Where did you find this? Gray Fox looked toward the northern mountains. I didn't. I've kept it, he said quietly. For a very long time. No one touched the tablet. Its surface seemed strangely warm. As though it had been waiting. Gray Fox gently placed one finger upon the ancient symbols. They once asked the same question. His voice was calm. Almost nostalgic. What is cultivation? The room fell completely silent. Outside, the afternoon breeze rustled the leaves beyond the academy windows. For a brief moment, it felt as though Genesis itself had paused, waiting to hear the answer. No one spoke. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the ancient stone tablet resting upon the academy table. It wasn't large. Barely the length of a man's forearm. Its surface had been polished so smoothly that the morning light reflected softly across it. Yet, the symbols carved into it seemed strangely alive. They weren't glowing, nor moving. But somehow, the longer one looked at them, the harder it became to look away. Chen Yu leaned forward. Can you read it? Gray Fox slowly shook his head. Not anymore. The room became even quieter. You can't? Sun Ling asked. I can remember pieces. Gray Fox answered honestly. But languages. He smiled faintly. Change. He gently brushed away centuries of invisible dust with the sleeve of his robe. I've carried this for a long time. No. He corrected himself. I've protected it. Nobody interrupted. Gray Fox continued. The people who carved these words. He looked down at the tablet. Asked the same questions you asked today. What is cultivation? Why are people different? Why does Genesis change? His fingers slowly traced one of the unfamiliar symbols. They believed cultivation existed to make them stronger. He paused. They were wrong. Those words echoed softly through the academy. Nia quietly sat beside the tablet. Notebook already open. What happened to them? She asked. Gray Fox remained silent for several moments. Long enough that nobody expected an answer. Finally, he spoke. They stopped asking questions. Nobody understood. Chen Yu frowned. That's all? Gray Fox nodded. They believed they understood Genesis. They named every mountain. Measured every river. Classified every creature. They mistook. He looked around the room. Knowledge. For understanding. The room fell into thoughtful silence. Outside, children's laughter drifted through the open windows. Someone was chasing another child around the academy courtyard. A baker shouted that fresh bread had just come out of the oven. Life continued peacefully. Yet, inside the academy, everyone felt as though they had just glimpsed something far older than themselves. Nia looked once more at the stone tablet. Can we study it? Gray Fox smiled. Of course. But remember, it isn't important because it has answers. It is important because it reminds us to keep asking. Sun Ling quietly looked toward the wall covered in questions. Hundreds of them. Questions from hunters, children, farmers, teachers, travelers. For the first time, he noticed something. Every answer written on the wall had eventually led to another question. Perhaps that was how knowledge truly grew. Not by ending curiosity, but by feeding it. The afternoon passed quietly. Instead of lessons, the academy became a workshop of ideas. The blacksmith arrived carrying several different hammers. I want to test grip strength. Old Lu brought sacks of grain. I want to compare endurance. Han Wei arrived with bows of different draw weights. I want to measure how much farther people can shoot. Children volunteered immediately. Mostly because they thought it sounded fun. Soon, the academy courtyard became filled with strange experiments. One group timed how long people could carry buckets of water. Another measured how far someone could hear a bell ringing. Several children counted how many seeds they could sort before becoming distracted. There were no winners. No rankings. Only numbers. Only observations. Watching everything from the doorway. Sun Ling smiled. We're becoming researchers. Nia laughed. No. She pointed toward the children excitedly arguing over whose hearing was better. We've always been researchers. We just didn't know it. As the sun slowly began setting, the first results were carefully copied onto fresh sheets of bark paper. No two people were the same. Some gained strength. Others developed balance. Some recovered more quickly. One elderly woman, despite remaining physically weak, could cultivate for nearly twice as long as anyone else without becoming mentally exhausted. Nobody understood why. Nobody tried to force an explanation. Instead, another page was added beneath the Human Observation Project. Current hypothesis. Cultivation does not create identical people. It strengthens each person according to their path, habits, and way of life. Further observation required. Gray Fox quietly read the words. For the first time that day, he nodded with genuine approval. They're beginning to understand. He whispered. They're asking the right questions. Just before everyone prepared to leave, a young girl timidly raised her hand. Nia smiled. Yes? The little girl looked around nervously. If cultivation helps everyone differently. She hesitated. Does Genesis choose our paths? The room became silent. Even Gray Fox looked toward her. Sunling thought carefully before answering. I don't know. He admitted. But he looked toward the people gathered inside the academy. I believe Genesis gives us opportunities. He smiled gently. The path is still ours to walk. The little girl nodded. Satisfied. Not because she had received an answer, but because someone had answered honestly. Night slowly settled over Haven. The academy lamps remained lit as teachers carefully stored away the day's records. Outside, the water wheel continued its steady rhythm. Hunters returned home. Farmers shared evening meals with their families. Children proudly told their parents about the strange experiments they had performed. Before leaving, Nia walked to the growing wall of questions. At the very bottom, she carefully wrote one more. If cultivation helps each person differently, what determines their path? She stepped back. Read the question once. Then smiled. It would not be answered tomorrow. Perhaps not this year. But one day, someone would. And when they did, humanity would understand Genesis just a little better than it had the day before. Far beyond Haven. Deep within an ancient forest untouched by human footsteps, something enormous opened its eyes. It did not roar. It did not move. It simply looked toward the distant horizon where humanity's first settlements quietly grew. Then, just as silently, it closed its eyes once more, as though deciding that it was still too early. Chapter 124 echoes across Genesis. The academy bell rang 3 times. Not to announce a lesson. Not to signal danger. But to gather every record keeper in Haven. Teachers closed their books. Hunters brought their journals. Farmers arrived carrying weather notes written on rough pieces of bark. Even the blacksmith arrived with soot still covering his hands. For the first time, the academy wasn't gathering knowledge. It was preparing to compare it. The main hall had changed greatly over the past month. One wall belonged entirely to children's questions. Another displayed maps of nearby rivers, forests, and settlements. A third wall held weather records. Near the entrance, a new board had been built. Across the top, Nia carefully wrote 4 words. Reports beyond Haven. The board was empty. For now. Sunling looked around the room. We've spent weeks observing Haven. He spoke calmly. I think it's time to understand what is happening outside it. Several people nodded. Everyone had reached the same conclusion. Lan Mei arrived shortly afterward. Behind her stood 3 travelers. Their clothes carried the dust of long roads. One wore a heavy fur cloak despite the mild weather. Another carried a satchel overflowing with journals. The third had a rolled-up map tied across his back. They greeted everyone politely. Not as strangers, but as fellow researchers. Nia welcomed them warmly. Thank you for coming. The eldest traveler smiled. You invited us. He patted the journal hanging from his belt. And we brought everything we could. Within minutes, the academy transformed into something resembling a council rather than a classroom. Maps covered the largest table. Journals lay stacked beside them. Pieces of charcoal moved from hand to hand as people marked observations across the parchment. Sunling noticed something interesting. Nobody argued over whose report was more important. Instead, everyone asked the same question. What did you notice? The first report came from the Eastern River Settlement. Lan Mei opened one of her journals. Fishing has become easier. She began. Several fishermen in Haven smiled. But, she continued, the fish themselves have changed. The room became attentive. They gather in deeper water. They move in larger schools. And, she paused while checking her notes, they avoid the northern banks after sunset. Hanwei quietly wrote the observation into his own notebook. Any idea why? He asked. Lan Mei shook her head. We've spent 12 nights watching. No predators. No unusual sounds. No changes in the river. They simply. She frowned thoughtfully. Stopped going there. Sunling marked the northern bank on the large map. No explanation. Only another pattern. The second traveler stepped forward. His home lay far west of Haven, near a region of rolling hills. Our hunters have noticed something similar. He explained. The grazing animals no longer remain in open fields. They feed. Then, they return to the forests before sunset. Wolves? Hanwei asked. No. They aren't being chased. They're behaving as though. He struggled to explain. They expect something. The academy grew quiet once again. Grey Fox remained near one of the windows. Listening. Never interrupting. The final traveler slowly unrolled his map. Unlike Haven's carefully drawn charts, his map contained many blank spaces. Large circles had been drawn around places nobody dared explore. He pointed toward one of them. Our scouts have refused to enter this valley. Why? Chen Yu asked. The traveler looked genuinely embarrassed. They don't know. They say. It feels wrong. Silence settled over the room. What does that mean? Nia asked. I don't know. He admitted honestly. There are no monsters. No strange sounds. No poisonous plants. He looked toward Grey Fox. But every person who enters leaves before sunset. And none of them can explain why. Nobody laughed. Because they had all experienced moments during the first trial that defied explanation. Nia slowly added another note to the board. Unexplained human reactions. Sunling looked thoughtfully at the growing collection of reports. Birds migrating. Fish changing habits. Animals following unknown routes. Hunters sensing silent forests. People avoiding certain places without understanding why. None of them seemed connected. Yet, together, they formed a picture far larger than Haven. Grey Fox quietly walked toward the map. He didn't point. He didn't explain. He simply looked at the many charcoal marks scattered across Genesis. Then, almost too quietly for anyone to hear, he murmured. It has started earlier this time. Sunling looked up immediately. What started? Grey Fox turned toward him. For just a brief moment, something unreadable crossed his expression. Regret. Memory. Perhaps both. But when he finally spoke, his voice returned to its usual calm. The questions. No one knew whether that answer was true. Or whether it hid another one. Outside, the afternoon breeze swept gently through Haven. Children chased one another between the houses. Builders continued raising another section of the warehouse roof. Farmers laughed while unloading freshly harvested vegetables. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet inside the academy, humanity was beginning to realize something profound. Haven wasn't changing. Genesis was. And for the first time, people from different regions were beginning to hear the same quiet echoes. The academy remained unusually busy long after noon. Normally, lessons would have ended by now. Children would have filled the streets. Teachers would have returned home. Today, no one seemed eager to leave. Every new report felt like another piece of a puzzle no one yet understood. Nia carefully redrew the large map of Genesis onto a fresh sheet of bark paper. The previous one had become crowded with notes. Colored charcoal marked different observations. Blue for rivers. Green for forests. Red for settlements. Black for unknown events. She stepped back. At first glance, the map looked chaotic. Yet, Sunling's eyes narrowed. What is it? Chen Yu asked. Sunling didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked closer. His finger slowly traced one report. Then another. Then another. The fish. He murmured. They moved north. He pointed toward another mark. The grazing beasts moved west. Another. The birds also moved west. Hanwei quietly unfolded his own patrol map. He placed it beside the academy's. Our rabbits, he added. They've also shifted farther west. Nobody had noticed before. Not because the information wasn't there. Because no one had compared everything together. Mia quickly drew several thin charcoal lines connecting each report. The room slowly fell silent. Nothing was random. Everything was moving. But toward what? One of the travelers whispered. No one answered. Gray Fox stood beside the window. Watching. Listening. Thinking. After several long moments, he finally spoke. Have any of you considered that perhaps they are not moving toward something, but away from something? The room became completely still. Away from something. Chen Yu frowned. What could frighten every creature? Gray Fox didn't answer. Not because he refused. Because he genuinely didn't know. Outside, a gentle wind stirred the leaves of the old riverside tree. Several birds landed upon its highest branches. They remained there only briefly. Then, without feeding, without resting, they lifted into the sky once more. Flying west. Hanwei happened to notice. He quietly walked outside. The old hunter soon joined him. Neither man spoke. They simply watched. There. The old hunter pointed. Another flock. Then another. Unlike ordinary migrations, these birds weren't traveling in large organized groups. Different species flew together. Songbirds. Water birds. Even birds of prey. Something that should never happen. Hanwei slowly opened his journal. He no longer wrote quickly. Every word now mattered. Observation. Different species now travel together. Natural behavior becoming increasingly unusual. He paused. Then added another line. Recommendation. Continue daily observations. Do not assume old knowledge still applies. Back inside the academy, the discussion had shifted. No longer toward animals. Toward people. Lan Mei spread several journals across the table. Our settlement noticed something else. Sun Ling looked up. What is it? She opened one page. 3 of our hunters began cultivating on the same day. They followed the same breathing exercises. They trained together. They ate together. They even worked together. Chun Yu smiled. So they should have progressed equally. Lan Mei slowly shook her head. They didn't. She turned the journal around. One hunter had developed extraordinary stamina. Another possessed sharper eyesight. The third showed almost no physical improvement. Instead, he could sense approaching rain nearly an hour before anyone else. The academy became thoughtful. Nia quietly wrote another heading upon the board. Individual adaptation. Not everyone changed equally. Not everyone changed similarly. Gray Fox walked toward the board. Without erasing anything, he added one sentence beneath it. Genesis does not shape everyone into the same person. It reveals the path each person is already walking. The room remained silent. The sentence was simple. Yet, it somehow explained every observation made during the past 2 days. The blacksmith slowly nodded. So, if I continue forging, my cultivation may strengthen my craftsmanship. Gray Fox nodded once. Old Lu smiled. And mine strengthens farming. Hanwei looked toward his bow. My hunting. One by one, people began understanding. Cultivation wasn't changing who they were. It was deepening what they had chosen to become. That realization spread through the academy like the first warmth of sunrise. Late in the afternoon, a messenger hurried through Haven's eastern gate. Dust covered his clothes. His breathing was uneven. Yet, there was no fear in his eyes. Only urgency. He carried a sealed wooden cylinder. Across its side, someone had carved the symbol used by every academy established after Haven. Nia immediately accepted it. It came from where? The messenger took a deep breath. Region 40781. The settlement beside the broken cliffs. Sun Ling recognized the name. They had never met. Only exchanged journals. Nia carefully broke the seal. Inside lay several neatly folded pages. The first contained weather records. The second described unusual animal behavior. The third made everyone stop reading. Written across the top, in large, hurried handwriting, were only 6 words. We think we understand now. Nobody spoke. Sun Ling slowly unfolded the remaining pages. There was no battle report. No warning. No request for soldiers. Only months of careful observations. Hundreds of small notes. Tiny changes. Patterns. Questions. Conclusions. The Academy of another settlement had been watching Genesis just as carefully as Haven. Sun Ling smiled faintly. We're no longer studying alone. Outside, the sun slowly disappeared beyond the western mountains. Its final light painted the sky with unfamiliar shades of crimson and violet. Birds continued their silent journey. The forest remained strangely quiet. The river never stopped flowing. Genesis offered no explanations. Only more things to observe. And perhaps that was its greatest lesson. Not every mystery demanded an immediate answer. Some simply asked humanity to keep paying attention. Chapter 125, The First Observer. The messenger remained in Haven for 3 days. Not because he was tired. Not because he had nowhere else to go. But because the Academy refused to let him leave before copying every page he had brought. For 3 days, teachers worked beside hunters. Children helped copy simple sketches. Builders repaired damaged journals. Even Elder Zhao carefully rewrote faded notes so they would survive another generation. Knowledge had become as valuable as grain. On the 4th morning, the messenger prepared to leave. Sun Ling walked with him to Haven's eastern gate. The valley was wrapped in a thin blanket of mist. The world felt strangely peaceful. The messenger adjusted his backpack. It was noticeably heavier than when he had arrived. Inside were copies of Haven's records. Weather observations. Cultivation notes. Animal migration maps. Even several pages of children's questions. I still think. The messenger laughed softly. Your academy is unusual. Sun Ling smiled. Why? I've visited many settlements. They trade food. They trade weapons. They trade tools. He gently patted the journals on his back. You're the first people who insist on trading questions. Sun Ling looked toward the academy. Children were already gathering outside its entrance. Some carried flowers. Others carried insects trapped inside carefully woven baskets. One boy proudly held a feather nearly half his height. We're still poor. Sun Ling replied. So? We trade what we can afford. The messenger laughed. Then bowed respectfully before beginning his long journey home. As the gate slowly closed behind him, Sun Ling remained standing there for several moments, watching until the traveler disappeared beyond the distant hills. A quiet voice spoke from behind. You've changed. Sun Ling turned. Gray Fox stood several steps away. His expression remained as calm as ever. So have you. Sun Ling answered. Gray Fox smiled faintly. No. I've simply remembered. Before Sun Ling could ask what he meant, Gray Fox looked toward the northern forest. Walk with me. Without another explanation, he began following the old hunter's trail leading away from Haven. Neither of them hurried. The morning air was cool. Drops of dew still clung to every blade of grass. The forest greeted them with the familiar scent of damp earth and ancient trees. For nearly an hour, neither man spoke. Eventually, Gray Fox stopped beside a small clearing. Sunlight filtered gently through the branches above. At its center stood a tree unlike any Sun Ling had seen before. Its bark shimmered with faint silver lines. Its leaves were deep blue. Not painted. Not glowing. Simply blue. Sun Ling approached cautiously. I've never seen this tree. You have. Gray Fox replied. You simply never noticed. Sun Ling frowned. What do you mean? Gray Fox rested one hand against the trunk. This tree has stood here long before humanity arrived. It blooms only once every few years. Most people walk past it without ever seeing it. Sun Ling looked around. The clearing wasn't hidden. The trail passed less than 50 steps away. How? Gray Fox smiled. Because people usually look for what they expect to find. They see trees. So they stop observing. The words lingered in the quiet forest. Sunling slowly walked around the ancient tree. Only then did he notice something else. Nothing grew beneath its branches. No grass. No flowers. No insects. Even the wind felt different. He crouched beside the roots. The soil wasn't dead. It simply felt undisturbed. As though countless generations had quietly agreed to leave this place alone. Gray Fox watched him silently. What do you notice? Sunling didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes. The academy had taught children to observe with patience. Now, he tried doing the same. The breeze. Cool. The earth. Moist. The air. Somehow heavier. Not difficult to breathe. Just denser. When he finally opened his eyes, he looked toward Gray Fox. The spiritual energy. He said quietly. It's stronger here. Gray Fox nodded. For the first time that morning, a genuine look of approval appeared on his face. You didn't sense it. He corrected gently. You observed it. Sunling remained thoughtful. There is a difference? A great one. Gray Fox answered. Anyone can sense power. He looked toward the shimmering blue leaves. But only an observer asks. Why is it here? The clearing fell silent once again. Somewhere far above, a single unfamiliar bird landed upon one of the blue branches. It remained perfectly still. Not feeding. Not singing. Simply watching. Sunling instinctively looked toward it. The bird's feathers shimmered with shades of emerald and silver. Its eyes were unlike any bird he had ever seen. Deep golden. Almost intelligent. The two locked eyes. Only for a heartbeat. Then, without making a sound, the strange bird spread its wings and disappeared deeper into the forest. Sunling continued staring in the direction it had flown. What was that? He asked softly. Gray Fox looked toward the empty sky. Instead of answering, he quietly asked another question. What did it do? Sunling thought carefully. It watched us. Gray Fox nodded. No. He smiled faintly. It observed us. For reasons he couldn't explain. Those two words no longer felt the same. The strange bird vanished into the endless canopy. Not a single feather drifted to the ground. Not a single branch swayed. Within moments, it was as though it had never been there. Sunling continued staring into the forest. His instincts told him to follow it. His curiosity urged him forward. Yet, he remained where he stood. Gray Fox noticed. A faint smile appeared on his face. You didn't chase it. Sunling slowly shook his head. It wanted to leave. And so, he looked toward the empty forest. I should let it. Gray Fox nodded once. A hunter who chases every movement returns home empty-handed. A researcher who chases every mystery often learns nothing. Sunling quietly remembered those words. The two continued deeper into the forest. The trail gradually disappeared beneath ancient roots and thick moss. Unlike previous patrols, Gray Fox never looked for landmarks. He walked as though the forest itself remembered him. Eventually, they reached a gentle stream. Crystal clear water flowed silently over smooth stones. Gray Fox knelt beside it. Instead of drinking, he simply watched. Several minutes passed. Sunling joined him. What are we waiting for? Gray Fox pointed toward the water. What do you see? A stream. What else? Sunling looked more carefully. Tiny silver fish swam between the rocks. Several insects skimmed across the surface. Nothing unusual. Then, one fish suddenly stopped. Moments later, every fish in the stream became perfectly still. Not frightened. Not hiding. Simply waiting. Almost half a minute passed. Then, without warning, the entire school darted downstream together. Only after they disappeared did a large shadow silently glide across the water. Sunling looked upward. Nothing. The sky remained clear. What was that? Gray Fox smiled. I don't know. Sun Ling blinked. You don't know? Gray Fox laughed softly. Must I know everything? For the first time, Sun Ling realized something. Gray Fox wasn't mysterious because he had all the answers. He was mysterious because he was comfortable admitting what he didn't know. The two continued walking. By midday, they reached the highest ridge overlooking Haven. The settlement looked peaceful from above. Smoke drifted lazily into the sky. The water will turn steadily beside the river. Children's laughter occasionally reached them even from this distance. It has grown, Gray Fox said quietly. Sun Ling nodded. It has. No, Gray Fox corrected. The people have. Sun Ling looked toward the settlement again. Builders no longer waited for instructions. Teachers no longer waited for lessons. Hunters no longer waited for danger. Everyone had begun thinking for themselves. Perhaps that was the greatest change of all. Gray Fox sat upon a large stone overlooking the valley. For several quiet minutes, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the scent of distant rain. Clouds drifted slowly across the unfamiliar sky. Finally, Gray Fox asked, Do you remember the first day? Sun Ling smiled faintly. Every day. What did you fear most? Sun Ling didn't answer immediately. His thoughts returned to the first trial. The blood. The hunger. The desperate struggle to survive. I feared dying. He answered honestly. Gray Fox slowly shook his head. No. You feared not understanding. Sun Ling looked at him in surprise. Gray Fox continued. You survived because you observed. You watched. You adapted. You didn't rush. He looked toward the endless forests beyond Haven. That is far rarer than talent. Those words settled deeply within Sun Ling. For a long time, neither man spoke again. As the afternoon sun slowly descended, they began their journey home. Halfway back, Sun Ling suddenly stopped walking. Gray Fox looked back. What is it? Sun Ling quietly knelt beside the trail. There, pressed gently into the soft earth, were footprints. Not wolf. Not deer. Not rabbit. Bird. Large. Much larger than the strange bird they had seen earlier. The tracks crossed the path only once, then disappeared into the undergrowth. Sun Ling carefully examined them. No signs of hunting. No signs of panic. No struggle. Gray Fox remained silent, allowing him to continue. The stride, Sun Ling murmured, is calm. It wasn't running. It wasn't hiding. It simply passed through. Gray Fox smiled. You've changed. Sun Ling looked up. I have? You no longer ask. What creature made these tracks? You ask. What was the creature doing? He nodded with quiet approval. Observation before conclusion. The first lesson. The two returned to Haven shortly before sunset. Life inside the settlement continued as usual. Merchants packed away their goods. Children chased one another through the square. The smell of evening meals drifted from dozens of homes. Nobody knew where Sun Ling had spent the day. Nobody asked. That night, the academy received one final entry. Not from Han Wei. Not from Nia. Not from a traveler. From Sun Ling himself. He carefully opened his journal. Then wrote. Day 104 since arrival. Today I learned that observing is not the same as seeing. Seeing tells us what is before our eyes. Observation asks why it is there. Perhaps the greatest danger in Genesis is not the monsters we fail to defeat, but the truths we fail to notice. He closed the journal. Outside, the unfamiliar stars slowly appeared one after another. Far beyond Haven, hidden deep within the ancient forest, the same strange bird landed silently upon the highest branch of the blue tree. Its golden eyes looked toward the distant lights of the settlement. It remained there for several long moments, watching, observing. Then, as quietly as it had come, it disappeared once more into the endless wilderness of Genesis. Chapter 126, The Path Within. The following morning, Haven felt no different than it had the day before. The bakery still opened before sunrise. The water wheel continued its steady rhythm. Builders raised another section of the warehouse. Children hurried toward the academy with more enthusiasm than discipline. Life moved forward. Yet beneath that ordinary morning, something had quietly changed. Not in Genesis. In the people. News of the academy's recent discussions had spread throughout Haven. Not through announcements, but through conversations. Around breakfast tables. At workshops. Beside irrigation canals. On hunting trails. Everywhere people gathered. The same question slowly emerged. What is my path? Near the southern fields. Old Lou was already working. Unlike previous mornings, he wasn't carrying farming tools. Instead, he carried 3 small clay pots. Each contained the same soil. The same seeds. The same amount of water. Several curious children gathered around him. Grandpa Lou. A little girl asked. Why are you planting the same seed 3 times? Old Lou smiled. I'm not. The children looked confused. I am planting. He gently touched the first pot. 3 questions. The children stared blankly. He laughed. The academy says observation is important. So, what happens if one pot receives morning sunlight? He pointed toward the second. What happens if another grows in the shade? Finally, he rested his hand on the third. And what happens if this one grows beside the river? The children looked at the pots again. This time, they no longer saw 3 identical plants. They saw an experiment. One excited boy immediately raised his hand. I want to help. Old Lou nodded. Good. But remember, we are not trying to prove ourselves right. We are trying to discover if we are wrong. The children quietly repeated those words. Not because they fully understood them, but because they sounded important. Inside the academy, the atmosphere had changed as well. Gone were the days when every lesson came from a teacher. Now, students regularly brought their own discoveries. One little girl proudly presented a leaf she claimed always turned toward the morning sun. Another boy had carefully counted how many breaths it took him to calm his heartbeat after running. A pair of sisters compared how long each could quietly cultivate before becoming distracted. Some observations were accurate. Others were completely mistaken. Nia accepted every one of them. She never laughed. She never dismissed an idea. Instead, she always asked the same question. How could we test that? Slowly, the academy stopped becoming a place where answers were given. It became a place where answers were searched for. Meanwhile, near the northern training grounds, Chunyu stood surrounded by several younger hunters. Each held a wooden spear. Each looked equally nervous. Again, Chunyu called. The group lunged together. Wooden spears collided with dull thuds. One hunter stumbled. Another overextended. A third reacted too slowly. After several rounds, everyone collapsed onto the grass laughing. I'm getting worse. One young hunter complained. Chunyu shook his head. No. You're noticing your mistakes. The young man looked puzzled. Isn't that the same thing? No. Chunyu smiled. When I first learned to fight, I thought strength solved everything. He looked toward the wooden spear resting across his knees. Now I spend more time learning how not to waste movement. The younger hunters quietly listened. None of them realized it. But Chunyu had changed. Months ago, he would have challenged them to another match. Today, he was teaching them to think. Not far away, Hanwei sat alone beneath a tree. His bow rested across his lap. His journal lay open beside him. He had stopped writing about animals. For today, he was writing about himself. Question. Why has my hearing improved more than my strength? He stared at the page. Then added another line. Possible answer. Because I have always relied more upon listening than fighting. He frowned. No. He whispered to himself. That's only a guess. He crossed out the words. Then wrote instead. Unknown. Continue observing. For some reason, that answer felt far more satisfying. By midday, Sun Ling found himself walking through Haven without any destination. He passed the fields, the workshops, The marketplace. The academy. Everywhere he looked, people were quietly experimenting, observing, questioning, learning. Nobody had ordered them to do this. Nobody had announced a new trial. Nobody had demanded research. Yet, the entire settlement had begun thinking differently. He eventually stopped beside the river. The water wheel turned with its familiar rhythm. The sound had become so ordinary that he almost didn't notice it anymore. A young boy approached carrying 2 buckets. He couldn't have been older than 10. Leader? Sun Ling smiled. Yes? The boy pointed toward the spinning wheel. I've been watching it. For how long? 3 days. Sun Ling raised an eyebrow. And what did you discover? The boy looked surprisingly serious. When the river rises, the wheel doesn't spin faster. It spins stronger. Sun Ling looked toward the flowing water. Then back at the child. What made you notice that? The boy shrugged. I got bored. Sun Ling laughed. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries began with simple curiosity. The boy smiled proudly. Then hurried away before remembering something. He turned around and shouted. I'm going to write it down. Watching him disappear into the streets, Sun Ling couldn't help but smile. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Haven wasn't its walls, nor its fields, nor even the academy itself. It was that an entire generation of children had begun believing that every question was worth asking. The afternoon sun slowly climbed higher. The valley remained peaceful. But beneath that peace, humanity had begun walking a path unlike any before it. Not the path of warriors. Not the path of kings. But the path of observers. And perhaps that was exactly the path Genesis had been waiting for. The afternoon breeze swept gently across Haven. Children slowly returned to the academy carrying the results of their tiny experiments. Some had discovered something. Many had not. Yet, no one seemed disappointed. A little girl proudly held up 3 leaves. They're exactly the same, she announced. Nia smiled. And what did you learn? The girl tilted her head. Nothing? The classroom laughed softly. Nia gently shook her head. You learned something important. What? That your idea wasn't correct. The little girl looked surprised. That's still a discovery. Several children quietly nodded. For the first time, being wrong didn't feel embarrassing. It felt useful. Across the room, another boy carefully placed several smooth stones onto the teacher's desk. I dropped them from the bridge. What happened? Nia asked. They all sank. Then why did you bring them? He smiled proudly. Because now I know stones don't float. More laughter echoed through the academy. Outside, the adults were unknowingly doing exactly the same thing. Only with bigger questions. Near the workshop, the old blacksmith had gathered several craftsmen around a long wooden table. Laid before them were 6 nearly identical hammers. Each had a different handle, different balance, different weight. The apprentice looked confused. Which one is the best? The old blacksmith smiled. I don't know. He handed 1 hammer to each craftsman. So let's find out. For the next hour, no one argued. No one insisted their opinion was right. They simply worked. Some preferred heavier tools. Others lighter ones. One carpenter discovered he made fewer mistakes with a shorter handle. Another found that a slightly curved grip reduced strain in his wrist. Instead of declaring a winner, the old blacksmith quietly wrote. Different people prefer different tools. Craftsmanship has no perfect answer. Nearby, Old Lou's 3 clay pots had attracted an audience. Several children had gathered beneath the shade of the large tree. Every few minutes, someone carefully checked whether the tiny seeds had sprouted. They're not growing, one child complained. Old Lou chuckled. Neither does a tree. Just because you're staring at it. The children laughed. Even so, none of them left. Patience was becoming another lesson. As the afternoon slowly passed, Sun Ling walked toward the northern watchtower. Not because someone had called him. Simply because he wanted to look. From the top of the tower, the entire valley stretched before him. Golden fields, The winding river. The slowly expanding settlement. Smoke rising peacefully from dozens of homes. Far beyond Haven. The endless forest. He rested both hands against the wooden railing. For a long while. He simply watched. Footsteps approached. Elder Zhao quietly joined him. Beautiful. The old man said. Sun Ling nodded. It is. Elder Zhao looked toward the distant horizon. When I was young. He began. I thought wisdom meant having answers. He smiled to himself. Now. I think wisdom begins when we become comfortable saying, I don't know. Sun Ling remained silent. The old man continued. The academy has changed Haven. But not because it teaches people. He looked down toward the children crossing the square below. It has taught them. That ignorance isn't shameful. It is simply where learning begins. Those words stayed with Sun Ling. As evening approached, the academy welcomed visitors once again. Not travelers. Not merchants. Ordinary people. A fisherman arrived carrying a broken net. I noticed something. A mother came with a small notebook. My daughter has questions. A builder entered holding a cracked roof tile. I think I made a mistake. Nobody came seeking judgment. Nobody came expecting immediate answers. They came because the academy had become a place where questions were valued. Late into the evening, Nia began organizing the growing collection of observations. There were now too many journals for one shelf. Too many questions for one wall. Too many reports for one teacher. She quietly turned toward Sun Ling. We're running out of space. Sun Ling looked around. She was right. The academy had begun as a single classroom. Now, every corner overflowed with knowledge. He smiled. I suppose. That's a good problem. Nia laughed. The best one we've had. Outside. The first stars appeared. Unlike those above Earth. Their patterns remained unfamiliar. No one had named them. No one understood them. Yet every night, they faithfully crossed the sky above Genesis. Waiting. For someone curious enough to begin asking questions. Before returning home, Sun Ling opened his journal. He no longer wrote only about survival. His entries had become quieter. More thoughtful. He dipped the charcoal into fresh ink and wrote. Day 105 since arrival. Today I realized something unusual. The academy no longer belongs to its teachers. It belongs to everyone who refuses to stop asking questions. Perhaps that is how every civilization truly begins. Not with walls, but with curiosity. He closed the journal and extinguished the lamp. Far beyond Haven. Beyond the rivers. Beyond the forests. Beyond every road humanity had yet to travel. A lone figure stood atop the ruins of an ancient stone tower. Its face remained hidden beneath a weathered hood. In its hand rested a journal so old that its pages had turned the color of faded ivory. The figure slowly opened it. On the final page, a fresh line of writing quietly appeared on its own. Humanity has begun observing. The hooded figure read the sentence in silence. Then, very slowly, closed the journal. No smile. No words. Only a single whisper carried away by the wind. The next step has begun. The ancient ruins returned to silence. As if they had been waiting. For exactly this moment. Chapter 127, A World That Watches. A week passed quietly. No disasters struck Haven. No monsters attacked its walls. No mysterious system announcement echoed across Genesis. Yet, nobody believed nothing had happened. The academy had changed the settlement in ways no one had expected. People no longer accepted the world at first glance. They observed. They compared. They questioned. And slowly, Genesis began revealing things it had hidden in plain sight. Just after sunrise, Hanwei's hunting party gathered before the northern gate. Unlike previous patrols, today's mission wasn't to hunt. Each hunter carried enough food for 2 days. A journal. Charcoal pencils. Measuring cord. Small wooden markers. Even a simple compass crafted by Haven's engineers using a magnetized iron needle. Chun Yu looked over the unusual equipment. He couldn't help smiling. We've become strange hunters. Hanwei adjusted his backpack. No. He replied. We're observers who happen to carry bows. Several hunters laughed. Yet, none of them disagreed. Before they departed, Nia handed Hanwei a neatly folded sheet. At the top, written in careful handwriting, were the Academy's newest field guidelines. Academy Observation Protocol. Observe before acting. Record before concluding. Compare before believing. If uncertain, write unknown. Hanwei read the page once, then carefully tucked it into his journal. I think. He smiled. This might become more important than my arrows. The heavy wooden gate slowly opened. The patrol disappeared into the morning forest. Inside Haven, the Academy welcomed visitors from every profession. Today's lesson wasn't held inside a classroom. Instead, everyone gathered beneath the large riverside tree. Farmers, builders, hunters, teachers, children. Even Elder Zhao sat quietly among them. Nia placed a large empty basket in the center. She smiled. Today's assignment is simple. Everyone looked at her expectantly. Bring me. She paused. Something you've never paid attention to before. Confused looks spread through the crowd. Then laughter. The assignment sounded almost childish. Yet, by now, everyone trusted there was a reason. Within an hour, people began returning. A little girl brought a feather unlike any the Academy had recorded. A fisherman carried an unusually smooth river stone. A carpenter returned with a piece of bark whose patterns resembled flowing water. One elderly woman simply brought a handful of unfamiliar seeds. Each object found its place inside the basket. Not because it was valuable, but because someone had noticed it. Chen Yu arrived last. Empty-handed. Nia looked surprised. You found nothing? Chen Yu scratched the back of his head. I found too many things. The crowd chuckled. What do you mean? He looked around the settlement before answering. I've walked this road almost every day. He pointed toward the western street. I've never noticed. Every house casts its shadow in exactly the same direction at sunrise. Several people instinctively turned to look. He was right. Then Chen Yu pointed toward the watchtower. I also realized. The morning birds never land on its roof. Again. No one had ever noticed. He shrugged. I didn't know what to bring. So, I brought questions. For a brief moment, the Academy became completely silent. Then Nia smiled. I think, she said softly, those are the best discoveries today. Meanwhile, several kilometers north of Haven, Hanwei's patrol followed an old game trail. The forest remained peaceful. Too peaceful. The usual chorus of birds was still absent. Only the occasional rustle of leaves disturbed the silence. The youngest hunter suddenly raised his hand. Everyone stopped. What is it? Hanwei asked. The young hunter pointed toward the soft ground. There. Footprints. Not fresh. Not old. Perfectly preserved in damp earth. Hanwei crouched beside them. Wolf. 3 adults. 1 juvenile. The tracks looked ordinary. Until he noticed something unusual. The spacing between each step. He quietly removed a measuring cord from his bag. The other hunters exchanged puzzled looks. Instead of following the trail immediately, Hanwei measured every stride. Every angle. Every distance. The old hunter watched with growing curiosity. Finally, he asked, what are you looking for? Hanwei finished writing before answering. I'm not sure yet. He looked toward the direction the wolves had traveled. But, he tapped the measurements. They weren't hunting. The younger hunters frowned. How can you tell? Hanwei pointed at the ground. If they were chasing prey, the spacing would change. They'd accelerate. Their formation would break. He slowly stood. But every step, he looked deeper into the forest, is almost identical. They were walking together. Calmly. The old hunter smiled. 20 years ago, he said quietly, I would have walked right past those tracks. Hanwei nodded. So would I. Far above them, hidden among the dense canopy, 2 golden eyes watched the hunters below. Motionless. Patient. Observing. No growl echoed through the forest. No attack came. Only silence. As if the forest itself had begun studying humanity in return. The hunters remained where they were. No one reached for a weapon. No one spoke above a whisper. The forest felt attentive. Not hostile. Not welcoming. Simply aware. Hanwei closed his journal and slowly looked around. The towering trees stretched endlessly in every direction. Sunlight filtered through layers of emerald leaves, creating shifting patches of light upon the forest floor. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet every instinct he had developed during the first trial told him otherwise. Not danger. Presence. The oldest hunter quietly stepped beside him. You feel it too. It wasn't a question. Hanwei nodded. The forest feels. He searched for the right word. Different. The old hunter smiled faintly. When I was young, my father taught me something. He rested one hand against the rough bark of an ancient tree. He said, there are days when you walk through a forest. And there are days when the forest walks around you. No one fully understood what he meant. Yet, everyone instinctively became quieter. Instead of continuing deeper, Hanwei changed the patrol's route. Not out of fear. Out of curiosity. I want to circle the valley, he said. If something is changing, I don't want to see only one side of it. The others agreed. Within minutes, the patrol split into pairs, each taking a different path while remaining within signaling distance. Not to cover more ground, but to compare observations. Meanwhile, back in Haven, the academy courtyard had become surprisingly lively. The basket Nia had placed earlier was overflowing. Children continued bringing objects they considered interesting. A feather that changed color in sunlight. A strangely shaped acorn. A smooth stone with tiny blue crystals running through its center. Instead of placing them randomly, Nia began organizing them. Plants. Minerals. Animal remains. Unknown. One curious child looked at the growing collection. Teacher, will these become a museum? Nia laughed softly. Maybe one day. But not yet. Why not? Because. She carefully placed the blue stone onto an empty shelf. We still know too little. If we give something a name too quickly, we might stop looking at it. The children quietly considered those words. One little girl looked toward the shelf labeled unknown. It doesn't sound scary anymore, she admitted. What? The word. She smiled. Unknown. I used to think it meant something dangerous. Nia gently shook her head. No. It simply means we haven't learned enough yet. Across the courtyard, Elder Zhao listened silently. He smiled to himself. Not because of the answer, but because children were beginning to see uncertainty as the beginning of discovery instead of the end of understanding. Far from Haven, Hanwei's patrol regrouped near a rocky stream. Each pair opened their journals. One by one, they compared notes. The first pair had found fresh deer tracks. The second, no large animals at all. The third, several unfamiliar plants growing where none had existed before. Hanwei spread every journal across a flat stone. For nearly half an hour, no one spoke. They simply compared, measured, read, crossed out mistaken assumptions, added new questions. Finally, Hanwei noticed something. The animals. He murmured. They aren't avoiding this valley. Everyone looked up. They're avoiding. He pointed toward the map. This hill. The old hunter leaned closer. You're right. Every migration. Every detour. Every altered trail. No matter where it began. Eventually curved around one particular ridge. Yet, no hunter had ever reported monsters there. No strange sounds. No unusual smell. Nothing. Only absence. Hanwei carefully drew a circle around the location. Then wrote beneath it. Area 17. Avoid conclusions. Further observation required. No one suggested investigating immediately. Not yet. One observation was never enough. As the sun began its slow descent, the patrol started home. The return journey was quieter than usual. Not because they had failed, But because they had learned that asking better questions was harder than finding simple answers. Back in Haven, Sun Ling stood on the watchtower overlooking the western road. Several travelers could be seen in the distance. Some pushed wooden carts. Others carried woven baskets. Children laughed as they raced ahead of their parents. Life continued. Peacefully. Shen Yu climbed the tower carrying 2 cups of warm herbal tea. He handed one to Sun Ling. "You've been thinking." Sun Ling smiled. "When am I not?" Shen Yu leaned against the railing. "The settlement feels different." "It does. But not because Genesis changed." Shen Yu continued. "Because the people did." For a while, neither of them spoke. They watched Haven below. A builder patiently teaching an apprentice. A mother reading beside her daughter. Hunters discussing maps instead of boasting about kills. Farmers comparing notes on soil instead of arguing over methods. Finally, Shen Yu chuckled. "Do you remember the first week?" Sun Ling laughed quietly. "Unfortunately, we couldn't even sleep without taking turns keeping watch. And now." Shen Yu pointed toward the square where several children were drawing maps with pieces of charcoal. "They're arguing about whether a bird nests higher on the eastern trees than the western ones." Sun Ling watched them for a long moment. Then his expression gradually became thoughtful. "They're growing up in a different Genesis than we did." Shen Yu looked at him. "Is that a bad thing?" Sun Ling slowly shook his head. "No. I think." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly what we fought for." As evening settled over the valley, the academy received one final visitor. It wasn't a hunter. Nor a traveler. Nor a farmer. It was a little boy no older than 8. He carefully placed a single drawing onto Nia's desk. She looked down. The drawing showed the forest. A large blue tree. And a strange bird with golden eyes resting upon one of its branches. Nia looked surprised. "Where did you see this?" The boy looked confused. "I didn't. I dreamed about it." The room became unexpectedly quiet. Nia smiled gently and accepted the drawing without comment. After the boy left, she pinned it onto the unknown board. Not because she believed it. Not because she dismissed it. But because it was another observation. Another question. Another thread waiting to be understood. Outside, night slowly embraced Haven. Deep within the endless forests of Genesis, golden eyes opened once more. This time, they did not watch Sun Ling. Nor the hunters. Nor Haven. They watched the academy. And somewhere, hidden beyond the reach of human sight, something ancient seemed to acknowledge. That humanity had finally begun asking the right questions. Chapter 128, The Quiet Current. 3 days passed. No alarms echoed across Haven. No monsters appeared beyond its walls. No urgent messages arrived from distant settlements. Yet, the academy had never been busier. The more humanity observed, the more questions Genesis offered in return. At sunrise, Nia stood before a newly built wooden board. Unlike the others, it held no reports. No maps. No questions. Only a single sentence. Every observation is valuable. Every conclusion must wait. The words were simple. But over the past weeks, they had quietly become the academy's foundation. A group of children gathered beneath the board. One little boy raised his hand. "Teacher?" "Yes?" "How long do we have to wait before making a conclusion?" Nia smiled. "As long as necessary." The children looked disappointed. "That could take forever." "It might," she admitted. But a wrong answer accepted too early. She tapped the board. "Can delay the truth for years." The children exchanged thoughtful looks. Perhaps patience was becoming harder to learn than reading. Outside, Haven streets were growing livelier every day. Travelers had become common visitors. Merchants exchanged seeds instead of coins. Builders discussed new bridge designs. Hunters compared maps before comparing trophies. The settlement no longer felt like a camp. It felt like a town. Near the river, the water wheel continued turning. Steady. Reliable. A group of engineers surrounded it with charcoal and measuring ropes. Sun Ling approached curiously. "What are you building?" One young engineer looked up excitedly. "Nothing." Sunling raised an eyebrow. Nothing? We're trying to understand why the wheel turns slower in the morning. He pointed towards several carved marks on one of the support beams. We've been measuring it every hour. Another engineer added. The river isn't changing. The wheel isn't damaged. But something, he frowned, is different. Sunling walked closer. Several pages of observations lay beside the riverbank. They had recorded water depth, current speed, wind direction, temperature, even the number of fish swimming beneath the wheel. Everything. Except the answer. Sunling smiled. Keep observing. The engineers nodded enthusiastically. For them, not knowing had become exciting. Meanwhile, at the academy, Gray Fox stood before the enormous map of Genesis. He studied it silently. His eyes slowly moved across rivers, forests, mountains, ancient ruins. Most people saw a map. Gray Fox saw memories. Thousands of them. Some joyful. Most painful. Footsteps approached. It was Elder Zhao. He quietly stood beside him. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Elder Zhao asked, "You've walked this world longer than any of us." Gray Fox remained silent. What was Genesis like? Before humanity arrived? A long silence followed. Gray Fox looked toward the morning sky visible through the academy windows. It was. He searched for the right words. Quieter. Elder Zhao waited. There were no roads. No smoke. No laughter from children. No fields. He smiled faintly. And yet, it was never empty. Elder Zhao nodded thoughtfully. You miss it. Gray Fox looked toward Haven outside. Children ran across the square. Someone laughed loudly near the bakery. A blacksmith shouted at his apprentice. Gray Fox watched them for a long moment. Finally, he smiled. No. I simply remember it. Far beyond Haven, Hanwei and his patrol had reached the ridge-marked Area 17. The place every animal seemed to avoid. Unlike before, they didn't enter immediately. Instead, they climbed the neighboring hill. From there, they spent the entire morning watching. Hours passed. No monsters appeared. No strange sounds echoed. Nothing unusual happened. The youngest hunter eventually sighed. Maybe we imagined it. Hanwei didn't answer. He simply continued watching. The old hunter beside him suddenly whispered, "There." Everyone followed his gaze. A family of horned deer emerged from the forest. They grazed peacefully, moved toward the valley. Then, without any visible reason, every single one stopped. They stood perfectly still, almost as if listening. Moments later, the herd quietly turned. Not running. Not frightened. Simply choosing another path. The hunters watched in complete silence. Not one deer stepped into Area 17. Not even by accident. Hanwei slowly wrote. Animals are making decisions before reaching the valley. Cause remains unknown. He closed the journal. For the first time, he didn't feel frustrated by the lack of answers. He felt privileged to witness a question no one had solved before. Back in Haven, a young girl carefully carried 3 clay pots into the academy. Old Lu followed behind her. All 3 seeds had finally sprouted. The children gathered excitedly around them. The first plant had grown tall. The second remained short but developed broader leaves. The third, growing beside the river, displayed faint blue veins running through its stem. No one had ever seen such a thing. The classroom erupted into whispers. Did we do something wrong? One child asked. Old Lu slowly shook his head. I don't know. He smiled warmly. But this is why we observe. Nia carefully sketched each plant into the Academy's journal. Not as proof. Not as fact. Only as another page in humanity's growing understanding of Genesis. Outside, the afternoon breeze gently rippled across the fields. The river continued flowing. The unfamiliar stars waited patiently beyond the daylight sky. Invisible changes continued their quiet work. Like a current beneath calm water, Genesis was moving. Whether humanity noticed Or not. As the sun drifted toward the western horizon, Haven settled into its familiar evening rhythm. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. Families gathered around simple wooden tables. Freshly baked bread, roasted vegetables, and dried meat filled the air with comforting aromas. Months ago, people had eaten quickly, always prepared to run. Now, meals had become conversations. Inside one small home, Chunyu sat across from Elder Zhao and two young hunters. The table was simple. The discussion was not. One of the younger hunters suddenly asked, "Elder, why do you cultivate?" The old man looked genuinely surprised. He slowly placed his wooden bowl on the table. "When I first arrived here," he began quietly, "I cultivated because I didn't want to die." The room fell silent. "And now?" Chen Yu asked. The old man smiled. "Now, I cultivate because I wish to live." The younger hunters looked confused. "Aren't those the same thing?" Elder Zhao gently shook his head. "No. Surviving," he looked toward the settlement outside the window, "is only the beginning. Living is everything that comes after." The words lingered in everyone's heart long after the conversation ended. Elsewhere, the academy remained brightly lit. Nia was organizing hundreds of observations collected over the past week. The shelves had become so full that several journals now rested in neat stacks upon the floor. She sighed softly. "We're going to need another building." Sun Ling looked around the room. She wasn't exaggerating. There were journals from hunters, farmers, engineers, builders, travelers, children, doctors, craftsmen. Each profession had begun recording Genesis through its own eyes. Sun Ling gently picked up one journal at random. It belonged to a carpenter. He smiled as he read. Day 103. The wood from eastern trees bends more easily after rain. I do not know why. I will build 2 chairs. One from eastern wood. One from western wood. I will compare them next month. Another journal belonged to a fisherman. Day 104. Fish no longer bite before sunrise. They now gather closer to deeper water. Perhaps I should stop fishing the way I did on Earth. Another belonged to a little girl. Question. Why do stars here twinkle differently? Father says he doesn't know. Teacher says we should keep watching. Sun Ling quietly closed the journal. A warm feeling spread through him. These weren't records of war, nor heroism. They were records of a civilization learning. Gray Fox entered silently. His eyes moved across the countless journals. For a brief moment, something resembling nostalgia crossed his face. Long ago. He spoke softly. I knew a people who believed knowledge belonged only to scholars. He walked slowly between the shelves. They built magnificent libraries. They filled them with answers. He stopped beside the journal written by the little girl. But he smiled gently. They forgot that curiosity belongs to everyone. He carefully returned the journal to its place. A civilization that stops asking questions has already begun disappearing. No one replied. Not because they disagreed. Because everyone instinctively felt the truth behind those words. Outside, night had fully settled over Haven. The unfamiliar constellations slowly revealed themselves one by one. Unlike Earth, their patterns shifted almost imperceptibly throughout the year. No one had noticed. Yet, near the northern gate, the night watch quietly changed shifts. Han Wei climbed the wooden stairs carrying his journal. Instead of immediately scanning the forest, he looked upward. The stars. He had stared at them countless times since arriving in Genesis. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered if they were changing too. He carefully opened a fresh page. At the top he wrote, Sky Observation Log. Constellation above the northern mountain appears slightly lower than last month. Unsure if memory is accurate. Begin nightly sketches. He closed the journal. No certainty. Only another question. At almost the same moment, far beyond Haven, a traveler from region 40781 paused beside a lonely campfire. He removed a rolled piece of bark paper from his pack. It bore the seal of Haven's Academy. By firelight, he carefully added a new entry. Shared observation. Haven has begun recording the stars. We shall do the same. He smiled faintly. separated by forests, rivers, and mountains. Humanity had unknowingly begun the same journey. Not toward one city, but toward understanding. Deep within Genesis. In a valley where no human had ever walked. The blue-veined plants growing beside a silent stream gently swayed despite the complete absence of wind. Nearby, the enormous creature that had remained asleep for so long slowly lifted its head. It did not awaken because of hunger. Nor because of danger. It simply listened. Somewhere. Very far away. Something had changed. Not the world. Humanity. For a long while, the ancient being remained perfectly still. Then, with slow deliberate movements, it turned its gaze toward the distant east. Toward the growing lights of human settlements. Its deep golden eyes reflected neither hatred nor affection. Only curiosity. As if it were asking itself the same question that echoed through the academy. What path will they choose? The creature closed its eyes once more. Genesis was patient. It had always been patient. It could wait a little longer. Back in Haven. Before extinguishing the final lamp, Nia walked to the large wall of questions. There was almost no empty space left. She looked at every question. Some had waited months. Others had only been written that morning. Then, in the last remaining corner of the wall, she carefully added one final line. Can a world observe those who are observing it? She stepped back. For a brief moment. The room felt strangely quiet. As though Genesis itself had heard the question. Chapter 129, The First Resonance. The academy bell rang before sunrise. Not once. Not twice. But 5 slow chimes. Every teacher immediately recognized the signal. It wasn't an emergency. It meant a shared observation required immediate discussion. Within minutes, the academy's main hall began filling with people. Hunters arrived carrying journals. Farmers carried bundles of newly harvested crops. Craftsmen brought unfinished tools. Travelers who had stayed the night entered with maps tucked beneath their arms. Even children quietly took their usual places along the back wall. Nobody wanted to miss what had happened. Nia stood before the large observation board. For several moments, she simply looked at everyone gathered. Then she spoke. Over the past 20 days, we have received reports from 7 neighboring settlements. She gently placed 7 journals upon the central table. Each report describes different events. She opened the first journal. Region 40781. Herds migrating west. Another. Region 19308. Spiritual herbs blooming earlier than expected. Another. Region 28114. River currents slowing during sunrise. Another. Region 56291. Birds refusing to nest near abandoned ruins. One after another. The reports continued. No attacks. No disasters. Only changes. Nia slowly looked around the room. Individually. She smiled faintly. They appear unrelated. She turned toward the enormous map hanging across the wall. But together. She picked up a piece of charcoal. One by one. She marked every settlement. Then connected each observation with thin lines. The room slowly became silent. The lines formed something unexpected. Not a pattern of movement. A pattern of timing. Every settlement had noticed changes. Within the same 2-week period. Old Lou quietly stood. So, it isn't Haven changing. No. Nia replied. It isn't one forest. It isn't one river. She looked toward everyone gathered. It's Genesis. The words settled over the room. Not as fear. As realization. Sunling remained silent. He studied the map carefully. His eyes never left the charcoal lines. Something still didn't fit. What's wrong? Chen Yu quietly asked. Sunling slowly walked closer. The timing. Everyone looked toward him. If Genesis is changing. He pointed toward the journals. Why doesn't every place notice the same thing? Silence. The question hung heavily in the room. Nia frowned thoughtfully. The rivers changed first. The forests later. The animals after that. The people. She looked toward the human observation board. Last. Grey Fox, who had remained near the doorway the entire morning, finally spoke. Because change does not travel. The room became completely quiet. It spreads. Nobody interrupted. Gray Fox slowly walked toward the map. Instead of pointing at Haven, he rested one finger near the center of Genesis. A place no human settlement had reached. Only endless mountains. Ancient forests. Blank space. Drop a stone into still water. He said quietly. What happens? A ripple. One child answered immediately. Gray Fox smiled. Exactly. The water closest to the stone changes first. The water farthest away changes later. Nobody breathed. He removed his hand from the map. What if Genesis is doing the same? The room remained silent long after he finished speaking. Not because they believed him. Because it was the first explanation. That made sense. Outside, clouds slowly drifted across the unfamiliar sky. The valley remained peaceful. Yet, for the first time, humanity began wondering whether somewhere beyond the lands they knew, the first ripple had already begun. Later that morning, Sunling walked alone toward the river. His thoughts remained fixed upon Gray Fox's words. A ripple. He whispered. He picked up a small pebble, then gently dropped it into the calm water. Tiny circles spread outward, one after another, each growing wider, each becoming weaker, until they disappeared completely. He watched them for a long time. What if, he murmured to himself, we're not standing at the center? What if we're only watching the edge? The thought sent a quiet chill through him. Because if Haven had only reached the edge of Genesis' changing current, then somewhere, far beyond every known road, something else had changed long before humanity ever noticed. Behind him, a child's voice interrupted his thoughts. Leader Sunling? He turned. The little boy from the water wheel experiment stood there carrying another notebook. I think, the boy said shyly. The river changed again. Sunling smiled. Show me. The boy eagerly opened his journal. Across several pages, he had drawn the water wheel every morning for 12 consecutive days. Each drawing included measurements: water height, current speed, the wheel's rotation, even the position of the morning shadows. Sunling quietly studied every page. Then, his expression slowly changed. The boy hadn't realized it. But hidden among the careful sketches was another pattern. One no adult had noticed. The river itself wasn't changing. The flow of tiny blue lights beneath the surface was. Sunling slowly looked toward the water. Tiny specks, barely visible beneath the morning sunlight, drifted silently with the current. Had they always been there? Or had humanity only just begun noticing them? He didn't know. But for the first time, he wondered if cultivation and Genesis were connected far more deeply than anyone had imagined. Sunling remained kneeling beside the river. The little boy stood quietly beside him, clutching his notebook with both hands. Neither of them spoke. The morning sun reflected softly across the flowing water. At first glance, the river looked exactly as it always had. Clear, calm, steady. Yet, when Sunling narrowed his eyes, he saw them again. Tiny blue specks. Countless tiny particles drifting with the current. They weren't glowing brightly. In fact, had he not been looking for something unusual, he might never have noticed them. The little boy looked up. Can you see them too? Sunling slowly nodded. I think so. I thought they were little fish, the boy admitted. But, he frowned. They never swim. Sunling remained silent. Instead of reaching into the water, he simply watched. Several minutes passed. The tiny blue specks drifted naturally around stones. Some disappeared beneath the water wheel. Others continued downstream. None of them seemed alive. Yet, neither did they resemble sand or pollen. Footsteps approached from behind. It was Nia. She had come looking for Sunling after hearing the boy's excited explanation. What did he find? She asked quietly. Instead of answering, Sunling simply pointed toward the river. Nia looked. At first, she saw nothing. Then, After several moments, she blinked. She whispered. I've never noticed those before. The little boy smiled proudly. I knew I wasn't imagining them. Nia quickly took out her notebook. Instead of writing a conclusion, she wrote only what she observed. Tiny blue particles visible beneath direct morning sunlight. Movement follows river current. No independent motion observed. She underlined the final sentence. Then added. More observations required. Sun Ling smiled. A few months ago, they might have called them spiritual energy. Or magical dust. Or some unknown treasure. Now, they refused to give them a name until they understood them. That alone showed how much Haven had grown. The three of them remained by the river until midday. As the sun climbed higher, something unexpected happened. The blue particles slowly became harder to see. By noon, they had almost disappeared entirely. They're gone, the little boy said. Sun Ling slowly shook his head. No. I think. He looked toward the river. The light changed. The academy immediately organized another observation. Not because they believed something extraordinary had happened. Because they wanted evidence. By afternoon, several volunteers had gathered beside the river. One group observed from the eastern bank. Another from the western bank. Children carefully sketched what they saw. Engineers measured the water's speed. Hunters compared visibility beneath different lighting. No one hurried. No one argued. Everyone simply observed. Meanwhile, Gray Fox watched from beneath the old riverside tree. He made no attempt to interfere. His gaze drifted from the river to the academy, to the children busily drawing their observations. For a brief moment, his expression softened. They're finally looking, he whispered, instead of merely seeing. Elsewhere, Han Wei had returned from the Northern Patrol. He walked directly toward the academy carrying fresh reports. As he crossed the settlement square, he noticed something unusual. The blacksmith's apprentice was lifting a beam that normally required two people. Not with ease, but with confidence. Nearby, Old Lu was carrying baskets of vegetables without pausing to rest. Children ran tirelessly between the houses. Even Elder Zhao's steps seemed lighter than before. None of them appeared surprised. The changes had become so gradual that everyone had quietly accepted them. Han Wei stopped walking. For the first time, he asked himself a question. When did this become normal? Inside the academy, the afternoon meeting had already begun. Today's discussion centered around one topic. Not the river. Not the forest. Not even cultivation. Observation itself. Nia stood before the room. She held up the little boy's notebook. This, she smiled, is why every observation matters. She looked around the hall. If he hadn't been curious, we would never have looked. The little boy's face turned bright red. Several adults laughed warmly. Old Lu stood. I've been thinking. Everyone turned toward him. When we first arrived, he began. We observed because we were afraid. We watched every shadow, every sound, every movement, because our lives depended on it. He looked toward the children. Now, we observe because we want to understand. Silence filled the academy. Not heavy. Comfortable. Sun Ling quietly nodded. Old Lu was right. Humanity hadn't stopped surviving. It had simply found another reason to pay attention. As evening approached, the academy received another courier. Unlike the previous travelers, this one carried no journals. Only a single folded page sealed with the symbol of another settlement. Nia carefully opened it. The message was surprisingly short. To Haven Academy. We have begun observing our rivers every morning. We also noticed faint blue particles beneath the surface. We believe they were unique to our region. It seems we were mistaken. No signature. Only the seal of Region 40781. The room fell completely silent. Sun Ling slowly looked toward the river outside. Then toward the letter. Then back to the map of Genesis. One settlement noticing something. Could be coincidence. Two settlements. Separated by hundreds of kilometers. noticing the same phenomenon. Was the beginning of evidence? Mia carefully pinned the letter beneath the heading. Shared observations. It became the very first report confirmed independently by two different regions. No celebration followed. No excitement. Only quiet satisfaction. Humanity had taken another small step. Not toward power, but toward understanding. That night, Sunling returned to the river one last time. The moonlight shimmered gently across its surface. The blue particles were no longer visible. He stood there in silence, listening to the steady flow of water. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt as though Genesis had whispered something. Not with words, but with patterns. And for the very first time, humanity had whispered back. Not through weapons. Not through conquest. But through careful observation. Somewhere far upstream, hidden beneath the dark waters, a faint current of blue light continued flowing unseen, quietly connecting rivers, forests, mountains, and perhaps every living thing in Genesis. Chapter 130, the week before the storm. 7 days passed. Not a single monster attacked Haven. No walls collapsed. No cries echoed through the valley. Life remained almost ordinary. Yet no one in Haven believed the world had become safe. They had simply learned that danger did not always arrive with claws. Sometimes, it arrived as a question. The Academy's main hall was fuller than ever. Entire walls had disappeared beneath maps, journals, and sketches. The shelf once labeled unknown had become an entire room. Children jokingly called it the room of questions. No one corrected them. Early that morning, Nia stood before a large map of Haven. Not the settlement itself. Its surroundings. Every hunting trail. Every river. Every hill. Every unusual observation from the past month had been marked using small colored pins. Blue. Green. Black. Red. Hundreds of tiny marks covered the parchment. Sunling quietly studied the map. Then, he noticed something. Not the pins. The empty spaces. There are places we've never visited, he said. Hanwei nodded. We've always hunted where food is. Collected wood where trees are plentiful. Built roads where travel is easy. He slowly pointed toward several untouched regions. We've ignored everything else. Greyfox, who had remained silent until now, spoke softly. Humans always explore where they need to go. He looked toward the untouched mountains. Very few explore. Simply to understand. That sentence stayed in everyone's mind. By midday, the Academy announced something completely unexpected. Haven Exploration Initiative. No military expedition. No monster hunt. No search for treasure. Only observation. Several teams would spend the coming weeks exploring regions surrounding Haven. Not to conquer. Not to settle. Only to understand. The announcement immediately filled the Academy with excitement. Children begged to join. Hunters volunteered before the meeting had even ended. Builders wanted to examine distant stone formations. Farmers hoped to study unfamiliar plants. Even several elderly residents quietly offered to help organize records. Sunling watched everything unfold with a smile. Months ago, people feared leaving Haven. Now, curiosity had become stronger than fear. Later that afternoon, Hanwei gathered the hunters. Large maps covered the table. Instead of drawing attack routes, he divided the surrounding wilderness into observation zones. Zone 1. Northern Forest. Zone 2. Eastern River. Zone 3. Broken Cliffs. Zone 4. Area 17. Nobody complained when Area 17 received only observation orders. One young hunter asked, "We still aren't going inside?" Hanwei slowly shook his head. No. One unanswered question. He looked around the room. Does not justify 10 unnecessary risks. The older hunters quietly smiled. That wasn't something Hanwei would have said during the first trial. He had grown. Meanwhile, inside the academy, the children were busy creating something of their own. Large sheets of bark paper covered the floor. Tiny hands carefully drew forests, mountains, animals, birds, flowers. Every child drew Genesis differently. One little girl approached Nia carrying her finished picture. Teacher. I don't know where to put this. Nia looked down. The drawing showed Haven surrounded by countless forests. But beyond them, the child had simply written, "We don't know yet." Nia smiled warmly. I think that's the most accurate map we have. The children laughed. Yet none of them erased those words. As evening approached, the exploration teams gathered for their final briefing. Not around weapons. Around journals. Each explorer received the same equipment. A compass. Charcoal pencils. Fresh bark paper. Simple measuring cord. Water. Food. Finally, Mia handed each team something unexpected. A blank page. At the top, only one sentence had been written. What surprised you today? Several hunters looked confused. That's all? Nia nodded. That's all. If you return without monsters. She smiled. But with one good question. You've succeeded. The room fell into thoughtful silence. For perhaps the first time in human history, an expedition had been sent into the unknown. Not to fight, but to learn. That night, Sunling stood alone upon Haven's watchtower. The valley glowed softly beneath countless lanterns. Children's laughter drifted faintly through the cool evening air. Workers finished repairing another section of the outer road. Someone played a simple wooden flute near the river. Everything felt alive. Chunyu quietly climbed the tower carrying 2 cups of warm tea. You always end up here. He laughed. Sunling accepted the cup. I suppose I do. For several moments, the two friends simply watched Haven below. Chunyu finally broke the silence. Do you ever think we've become too comfortable? Sunling didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed upon the peaceful settlement. Finally, he spoke. No. I think. He smiled faintly. We've become worth protecting. Below them, lanterns slowly illuminated every street. Families gathered together. Children chased one another through the square. The academy's windows remained lit long into the night. Everything humanity had built had been purchased with fear. Now, it was sustained by hope. Neither of them noticed. Far beyond Haven. Beyond Area 17. Beyond every road humanity had walked. The wind had changed direction. Very slowly. Leaves across an ancient forest turned toward the east. Animals quietly lifted their heads. Birds became silent. The enormous sleeping creature beneath the mountain finally opened its eyes. Not suddenly. Not violently. As though awakening from a dream it had carried for centuries. It did not roar. It did not hunt. It simply looked toward the distant horizon, where tiny lights marked humanity's growing settlements. For the first time, its ancient eyes reflected something new. Recognition. Then, without another movement, it took a single step. Far away. No human saw it. No academy recorded it. No journal mentioned it. Yet somewhere within Genesis, the first piece of a much larger change had quietly begun moving. And humanity still had one peaceful week left before it reached them. The following morning, Haven awoke beneath a sky unlike any in recent memory. The sun still rose in the east. The river still reflected golden light. The bells still echoed across the settlement. Everything looked normal. Yet, those who had spent the last month observing the world immediately sensed something they could not explain. The morning felt heavier. Not oppressive. Not frightening. Simply different. Old Lu was the first to notice. As he stepped into the fields carrying his familiar wooden hoe, he instinctively stopped. The crops looked healthy. Healthier than ever. Yet the breeze that usually danced through the grain had become strangely gentle. He closed his eyes. Listening. Nothing. No birds greeted the sunrise. He slowly opened his journal. Day 112. The fields appear healthy. The birds did not arrive. He paused. Then added another sentence. The silence feels familiar. He couldn't remember why. Only that it did. Across Haven, Hanwei prepared the first exploration team. The hunters checked their equipment one final time. This time, they carried fewer arrows than usual. Instead, their packs were filled with journals, measuring cords, drawing charcoal, simple wooden sample boxes. One young hunter looked embarrassed. "My father says." He laughed. "We look more like traveling scholars than hunters." Hanwei smiled. "Good. Because today, we hunt for understanding." The others laughed quietly. Yet, every one of them tightened the straps on their journals before checking their bows. Both had become equally important. Inside the academy, the atmosphere was filled with quiet excitement. Children crowded around the exploration teams. One little girl handed Hanwei a folded drawing. "For good luck," she whispered. Hanwei unfolded it. The drawing showed Haven, the academy, the river, the watchtower, and beneath them, in crooked handwriting, she had written, "Please come back and tell us what you learned." Hanwei carefully folded the drawing, then slipped it inside his journal. "I promise," he said. "We'll bring back answers." Nia smiled from nearby. "No," she corrected gently. "We'll bring back observations." Everyone laughed. Even Hanwei. The great wooden gates slowly opened. One by one, the exploration teams left Haven. Not marching. Not charging. Simply walking. Each following a different path into the vast unknown. Sunling watched until the final team disappeared beyond the hills. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt proud. Not because they were strong. Because they were curious. Gray Fox quietly joined him. Neither man spoke for a long time. The valley stretched peacefully below. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Children's voices drifted through the morning air. Life continued. Finally, Gray Fox asked, "What do you think they'll find?" Sunling smiled faintly. "I don't know." Gray Fox nodded. "Good." Sunling looked at him curiously. "You seem happy whenever someone says they don't know." Gray Fox laughed. A genuine laugh. One rarely heard. Because he looked toward the distant horizon. Certainty ends journeys. Curiosity begins them. Those words stayed with Sunling. The day passed quietly. Builders repaired another section of Haven's outer wall. Farmers harvested vegetables. Teachers continued lessons beneath the shade of the academy courtyard. Children filled the room of questions with even more drawings and observations. One child insisted that butterflies preferred blue flowers. Another claimed the river sounded different after sunset. Neither was dismissed. Both were written down. Late that afternoon, a courier arrived from another settlement. Not running. Not shouting. Simply tired from travel. He carried a single sealed journal. The cover bore the symbol of the academy established near the broken cliffs. Nia carefully accepted it. Inside were 23 pages of observations. Nothing more. Nothing less. She smiled. Humanity had begun speaking the same language. Not words. Observation. As evening settled, the academy held a small gathering. Not a meeting. Not a celebration. Simply a quiet meal shared by teachers, hunters, travelers, and children. During the meal, no one discussed monsters. No one spoke about power. Instead, people shared the most interesting thing they had noticed that week. The fishermen talked about fish changing their feeding times. The carpenter described discovering that eastern timber dried differently from western timber. Old Lou proudly announced that the blue-veined plant continued growing faster than the others. The children argued about whose experiment had been the funniest. Laughter echoed across the courtyard. For a brief moment, Genesis no longer felt like an alien prison. It felt almost like home. As darkness embraced the valley, Sunling remained outside after everyone else had returned home. He climbed the watchtower one final time. Above him, the unfamiliar constellation stretched across the endless sky. He opened his journal. The pages had become thicker over the months, filled with sketches, observations, questions, mistakes, lessons. He slowly turned back to the very first page. The handwriting was rough, uneven, rushed. Every sentence carried fear. He smiled to himself, then turned to a blank page. He wrote quietly, Day 112 since arrival. When we first came to Genesis, we believed survival meant defeating the world around us. Now I wonder if survival begins the moment we start understanding it instead. The Academy says every answer creates another question. Perhaps that is true for people as well. The more I learn, the more I realize how much remains unseen. He closed the journal. The wind gently turned a single page before settling again. Far beyond Haven. Far beyond the lands humanity had explored. The ancient being continued its silent journey. Each step was slow, measured, purposeful. Flowers bloomed where it passed. Small creatures emerged from their burrows only after it had gone. The forest did not fear it. The forest recognized it. High above, the strange bird with golden eyes circled once through the evening sky. It watched the ancient figure below. Then, without making a sound, it flew east, toward humanity. In the deepest chamber beneath the ruins of an ancient blue tower, a crystal that had remained dark for countless ages flickered once. A faint blue light spread through its cracks. Then, a calm voice echoed through the empty chamber. Not loud. Not mechanical. Ancient. Almost alive. Observation acknowledged. Humanity has entered the second phase of adaptation. Continue. The light faded. Silence returned. No human heard the message. No system notification appeared. Genesis had simply taken notice. And somewhere beneath the same unfamiliar stars, humanity continued sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that while they had spent months learning to observe Genesis had quietly begun observing them.